I'm Matzi and welcome to my first Unity tutorial. Boom. Today we're going to be talking about how to get started in Unity. We're not talking about all the ins and outs of code exactly. We're more talking about when you look at Unity, what is it you need to know in order to learn things. I've spent 15 years in the development industry. I haven't been a game developer, but I have learned a lot about learning how to code and learning systems and learning frameworks. And so some of the things that I look at when I learn something really focus on what you need to understand so that you can then understand other things. This introduction is trying to cut to the chase of some of the key components of Unity. So when you look at a Unity project, when you watch a Unity tutorial, you'll have a better understanding of how it all fits together. While I have a project open in the background right there, I wanted to quickly talk about the type of project I created. So when you go into Unity, you get Unity Hub, which is really what you need in order to have a proper new version of the software and do your installs and so on. When you create a new project, you have a bunch of options. For this tutorial, I am using a 3D project, just a baseline 3D project. It has very minimal stuff in it. What I'm about to talk about is relevant to 2D, except it's in a 3D space. Okay, so here is our Unity window. When you start out a brand new project, this is generally what you should see. When you look at another project, you might see a whole lot more stuff. This is actually a pretty simple view, and we're going to talk a little bit about the pieces of this window and what's important for you to focus on. First of all, just getting oriented on how the Unity window system works. It's meant to be very modular. You can basically move any of these pieces around to suit your needs. Any of these windows, these tabs can be moved around. So if I wanted the project tab to be up here, or if I want to be down here, if I wanted to get rid of any of these, I can close those individual tabs if they're in my way. And it's basically meant for you to suit it towards the needs that you have for your development process. If at any time you feel like you messed up your layout, you can always go to the window menu and you go to your layouts, and then you can choose whatever layout you want. For instance, I have a Matzi layout. This is what I use. And then there's also the default layout, which is what you usually get when you first start a project. So you can always mess around with that. If something doesn't make sense, doesn't feel right, you can move it around. You can move it to somewhere that makes sense. Down here at the bottom left, this is your project window. So your project window, your project tab, if you will, this is where all the files that make up your project live. So if you went into a file system, if you found these in the file system, which you can go to right click and go to show and explorer, you can see that the file system matches what you see in here, assets and packages. There's a couple other things that get stored, but primarily it's the assets and packages folder that you see in Unity. So that's all you really need to know is assets is like the main folder. So anytime someone talks about adding something to your project, usually it goes into your assets folder. Next, we have the hierarchy. The hierarchy is where your active scene lives. So your active scene is what you see here in this window. You can see here the scene tab. That window here represents basically the game space that you're editing. And you can see in here, it already has what's called a sample scene. So a scene essentially is a collection of stuff that gets used for any portion of the game. It's a whole collection of a scene, like a level or a stage. Those are other words that you might think of when you think of scene. And inside the scene are all the different objects that you might need to manipulate. On the right-hand side, this one right here, the inspector will show you information about anything that you have selected within your project. So if I click on the camera, I have all sorts of information about a camera. If I click on directional light, I have all sorts of information about the directional light. Inspector is a great place to go to find out more detail or configure more detail about the things that you're clicking on. Usually in the hierarchy is where you have things you can change, and down here in the assets, it's something that you can look at but not necessarily configure. The scene consists of something called game objects. So the thing about Unity is it's a framework that tries to make it easier for you to conceptualize pieces of your game. And a game object is just the highest level thing that makes up a game. It's an object of your game. It can basically be anything. And in fact, in a scene, everything is a game object. Even your camera is a game object. So this to me was really important to understand, because as a developer who works in frameworks all the time, it's really important to understand how the framework thinks about the objects that it works with in whatever space it's working in. In game development in Unity, the main unit, the atomic unit, if you will, the main parent unit of everything is a game object. And by default, you get a scene that has a camera and a directional light. If you look on the right-hand side here, each of these game objects have a bunch of what we call components. And the default component for every game object is a transform. Transform is just where it sits in 3D space. This is important to understand, that when you look at transform, when you look at camera, when you look at audio listener, all of those things are components. Transform is a component that you cannot remove. It's a component that is built into every game object, even ones that don't do anything within your scene, and they're just game objects. And they just sit there and you have script or you have something else that they do. They still have a transform. The special object, of course, is the camera. The camera happens to be something that you need in a scene in order to show something to the user. It's important to know that that camera is what's looking at the things that you will see when you play a game. And of course, you can't see anything in a scene without lighting. Lighting is another concept for 3D development, 3D art, that you just need to point a light at something in order to illuminate it. Let's talk about project settings, because this is another important piece. What if someone tells me I need to configure something about my gravity, or about my inputs, or any other things related to a project? If you look at your edit menu, there is a project settings option. It has many different settings, and if you're looking at tutorials, sometimes they will reference the project settings. When I'm working with project settings, I actually move it into a tab, so then I can quickly get access to things like the input manager or physics configurations. 3D needs physics, so you got to use that configuration. Again, this is about learning to learn and knowing some things to focus on that are important, because there are a lot of options. Someone actually mentioned or asked a question about the asset store. So here's what I'll say about the asset store. There's a lot of people selling a lot of stuff about Unity, and a lot of the stuff says, here's this great way to solve all your problems. And that's where you go for the asset store. There are some really good things in there. I highly recommend looking at it and researching it and seeing if the thing that you want does what you want it to do. But I would suggest, if you're just learning, probably stay away from the asset store. It's much better to go to a YouTube tutorial and read some tutorials online, or go to learn.unity.com, because that's the greatest place to get started with all the specifics on basically anything you need to do within Unity. There's also YouTube personalities like Brackeys. He has plenty of videos out there. Start there before you think about getting anything from the asset store. That's just my humble opinion. There may be people who think differently, but I happen to feel it gets really complicated. And I looked at the asset store as, this is going to solve all my problems, and all it did was make me feel more overwhelmed. And most of the assets have much more work involved to configure and use them than you think they're going to. Now, outside of the asset store, which is, in my opinion, something to avoid in the beginning, you can go to the package manager. A package manager helps you pull in new things that help you kind of get some of your projects done, your code done. Some of the packages are purely code-based, and you have to use them in code. Some of them let you do some things that eliminate the need to use code. So the package manager is important to know. And if you ever hear someone say, oh, you need blah, blah, blah thing, and you're like, well, that thing's not in my project, then you go to the package manager. The package manager is in the window menu. So you have a window, package manager. You could put the package manager just as a tab here. I don't go to it enough for it to matter. So I usually don't keep that visible to me, but I'm also a fairly new Unity dev, so maybe I'll figure out a new layout some point in the future. And as a new person, you may or may not need any of this. But what I will tell you is this. I guarantee you will watch a tutorial where someone is using something that you don't have in your system. And they might reference it. They might say the word Cinemachine, which is a very useful package to have. So you can go to the package manager and say, oh, they're using Cinemachine in this, so I need to get Cinemachine. And there you go. You can install a version of Cinemachine so you can follow along with the tutorial. Cinemachine is basically just a set of tools that make managing the camera better. And again, I'll do a little tutorial on that sometime in the future. Another one that I found useful is Input System. Input System is the new way that Unity has created for managing controller input, keyboard input, and so on. It does take a little bit more work, and from what I've seen from the tutorials out there, I've had to piece together information. As a new person, don't worry about it unless you find a really good tutorial. Just know it's there, and know that I will very soon, in the next week or two, do a little vignette tutorial on that as well. I find it to be much better to use than the old input system. So just know the package manager exists. Google it, look at Unity Package Manager, look at Unity Common Packages. There's a lot of awesome stuff out there. There's also other places that you can pull it from, so you could still get something from the internet. But, you know, in my opinion, usually it's best to start with what's ubiquitous, what's installed with the built-in registry rather than going somewhere external. Now that we've kind of had a quick sort of spin around the universe here, we've learned what a project is. We've learned what the inspector does. Let's see it all in action. So when you start, you have nothing here. You have a camera and you have a light. I can move the camera around, and when you go to mess with the camera, you can see there's a little camera preview that basically gives you the option to see, what it's pointing at, but there's nothing there. One thing that you're going to do a lot in Unity is right click to create game objects. You can see here, if I right click on the scene, or if I right click even on one of the objects here, I can add a game object of any type. I can create an empty object, which there's nothing in it. I can create a 3D object, which is of different types here. I can do even 2D objects in effects. So I'm not going to go into each one of the things that you could do, but if you know what a game object is, and you know what kind of game objects you can add, you can Google some of this stuff, because Google is a good tool for people learning things, and find out a little bit more about how it works. For our purposes, we'll start by adding what's called a plane, which is just a flat surface. I add the plane, a flat surface, assuming that I wanted to make a stage or something for a player to play on. And let's say I want to make it bigger. Up here are all the tools that you can use for modifying your 3D object. You have the movement tool, which is the little arrows. You have a rotate tool, which is this circular thing, which has different ways of rotating. You have a resize tool, and you have a box tool, which is kind of a different way to resize based on these little nubs at the end. And you also have a move, rotate, or scale tool, which is like everything in one. It's just, why do these 4 when you can just do this 1 and solve all your problems? For the plane, I want to make it a little bigger, so I'll go to the resize tool. Now, with 3D tools, this is a very common methodology. So if you ever use Blender, or if you do voxel work like I do, voxel tools have these sort of nubs and angles and things. This is just how you manipulate things in 3D space. So the nubs on the edge, those represent an axis you can move on. The nub in the middle is what you can use to drag it all at once. Other tools like Blender, they actually have an extra little nub for doing this type of effect, but Unity's a little bit more simple. But if I wanted to stretch it in one direction or the next, I can just pick it by the angle. Now this vertical one, which is the y-axis, doesn't do anything because it's a plane. It's supposed to be flat. And let's add something else to this. Why don't we just add a cube? So first of all, you may notice I just did this quick little drag here. This is the middle mouse button that I'm using to basically just grab and translate the 3D space, so I can kind of move things around. If I want to rotate, I use the right mouse. It gives me this little look. If I want to select something, I use the left mouse. This gives me a little common select button that you would see. I do tend to use the middle mouse button a lot. I zoom in and zoom out with the mouse scroll wheel. This is just basic usage. We've got the cube. I'm going to go back to the move tool just so I can get it, somewhere where I want to make it stand on top of here. Right now in this editor, there's no physics involved. There are ways to make the editor behave with physics, either by playing your game or using editor extensions. Don't worry about that for now. Just know for the moment you would have to kind of move and drag. All right, so we got 2 objects on the screen. Both of them have components on the right hand side. And all of these objects that are 3D, they come with some stuff built into them. they have something called a mesh renderer and a collider. These are the things that are responsible for actually rendering the cube, the mesh renderer. The mesh is like the skin of the object. And that can be treated in different ways. You put a texture on a mesh, or it can have a solid color. But that's really what is responsible for representing the structure of the object. A collider, that gets used a lot in the physics engine. It also gets used a lot when it comes to code. So a collider just says that something can run into this, and either it's going to actually be a physical collision, it won't, things can't go through it, or it could be a trigger and it will cause something to happen. That's, again, for the future, how to use colliders and triggers and all that stuff. That's for future tutorials. But knowing that's what that is important, because a lot of the tutorials you watch will tell you to use a collider, or it'll show you the use of collider. And so this isn't really magic words. It's just basically saying, here is a definition of a box that the player can't go through or that reacts to physics. And as I said earlier, these are all components. You can add and remove them. I can remove a component with this little vertical hamburger menu. I don't know what you call that. I can move it around. I can even copy it and paste it to other places by doing copy component. And then if I click on another one, I could do paste component as new. Again, all this stuff is something to play with, and when you start doing code, it'll be even more important to know that colliders get used a lot, and so do mesh colliders. I showed you the tools over here on the left that are used to manipulate this object, but if you're a person who likes to structure things more precisely, you can see here in the transform component, all of these values represent where it sits in 3D space. So if I want to change the rotation, I can literally change this by a number, right? I can just add one number. I can add 100 or whatever. I can change it directly and not use a tool that feels imprecise. I can also use any of these values like a little slider. Sometimes you want to change it precisely but without having to type in the numbers, right? You're still using your mouse, so you can mess with the scale. You can change it from here, as opposed to going to these tools on the left hand side. Here's one other thing is you might end up in a situation where you have just a bunch of objects around here. I'm just using copy and paste right now, and you can see as I do that, it just makes a copy of the game object. And you may want to be able to zoom in on one of these objects. I find that sometimes you just get kind of out of whack. You're way back here for some reason. Somehow you navigate it around. There's two ways that you can actually get kind of back on track. One is you can double click on the object on the left hand side. So double clicking on any of these basically brings it to focus. The other is that if you can get a click on it, I can click on it from there. You can also press the F key, which means focus, and gives you the focus of the object. I think as a beginner, someone who's navigating 3D space, that's super useful if you want to get close so you can manipulate the object, and you may be somewhere kind of out of whack. Usually this becomes a problem when your scene is much bigger and you have a lot more objects on the left-hand side. Something I didn't show earlier, any of these objects can be parents. So what it means is just like a file system, you can drag objects under other objects. This has very important meaning when it comes to working with your project. I found that when you had things like animations, like a box that moves up and down, if you put it inside a parent object, you can copy and paste it and move it around, and it'll put its position relative to the parent. So when I have a cube under here, this cube now, its position is relative to that parent cube. So you see how I move the parent and they all move with me. So that's really valuable and really important to know. You don't just put things under there to kind of group them. You also give it a way that you can manage all of them at once. You can move a big group of things all at once. And it also has some implications to things like animations and code and so on. One thing I want to say about collider though, when we talk about the object, like the definition, the mesh that makes up the object, that's different from the box that represents collision. And the best way for me to demonstrate this with a capsule, it's like a little pill. The capsule has a green outline around it. If I go to the capsule collider, and the collider, there's a way to edit just the collider, you'll see that there is this green wireframe. This is actually the collider. This is what tells Unity how collision works. So if I make it this big around this capsule, and you had a player that would interact with colliders, it wouldn't be able to even get close to the capsule, because this is actually what represents the collision area for that capsule. When you're learning the code and people talk about colliders, colliders have their own little wireframe that you have to work with. And it's somewhat annoying to work with sometimes, because if you look at the capsule versus the collider, you know, they're not always aligned. It depends on how you set it up, depends on how you added the collider. These are simple objects, but more complex objects or players, you know, you have to align them differently. Knowing that you can edit it on its own is pretty important, because this will be something when you start working with games and collisions that you'll want to know how to manipulate and move around on the screen. I want to point out something about this assets folder. Most times when you look at a project, this will be full of different folders, but some common folders that you are going to see almost just, you know, without fail. You're going to see a folder called scripts, and in that folder, there's going to be some code. Sometimes they call it code, sometimes they'll call it source. Scripts is a very common term. You create C# scripts that do things for you in the context of Unity. You're also going to see a folder called Prefab. This may be in a subfolder somewhere. Oftentimes people have an art folder, and then an art folder they have prefabs. It could be in many different places. Ideally, they only have one, but people set up their projects however they want. But prefabs are very important, and we will talk about that near the end here. You might have an art folder, and a lot of times the art folder has things like your actual physical assets, like if you're importing a 3D model, or you have textures or so on. The organization of it doesn't matter as much as the fact that it's there. You'll have animations and other things. There's a bunch of other things that you'll see, but the scripts one is really important, because that's where all the code goes. And there's a couple ways that you can create scripts. One, the simplest way, if you know what you're going to do, you can just go to create and you can create a C# script. It's called a behavior. Behaviors are just sort of actions on objects. So it's sort of behavior driven development. And in this case, I'll just call it a test controller. The name of it doesn't matter. You can call your object anything you want. Controller is a very common term, especially if it's controlling a character or so on, but it can basically be anything. To edit these scripts, you need some kind of editor. So VS Code is a very common thing, or Visual Studio. I use a tool called Writer, which is a JetBrains tool. It does cost money, but I find it fits my style better because I've been doing web development in that tool set for 15 years. That's one way, though, that you can create a script. When you have the script, you'll have to edit it at some point, but at least you know it exists. If you're using some existing assets, there'll be scripts that you might have to use. And if you're looking at an object and you see a component like this that says script, it means it's a script in the project. One thing that you can do to get access to that script, if in a component here, if you see a script, you can click on the name and it'll highlight it in the assets section. As you can see, what I did to add components was really simple. I just dragged it onto here. So most of the objects can do that. There's a lot of opportunities to take a thing and drag it, and it becomes part of whatever object is in the scene hierarchy. So I selected cube and I just dragged the script there. Another way that you can add a script is by clicking on add component. You can see there's all sorts of components you can add, but I can go to script and then I can actually say, I'll just start typing like my cube script. And you can see this is trying to search for something called my cube script, but it doesn't exist. So I can actually tell it to create a new script like I did there, and I can just create and add it. So when I create and add it, it's going to add it somewhere in my project. Click on here, and you see it just kind of added it somewhere random. Not my favorite, but you can always move it. And then you now have, two scripts. You can have many scripts attached. You can have scripts that add different behaviors, and it's sort of like a mix and match. So a lot of these assets you get from the asset store, they have a ton of scripts, and you plop the script in and you do stuff. But this is where it gets interesting. So as a developer, I would look at Unity and I'd say, man, this is so complicated. How does this work? How am I going to write code? So many different questions. But a lot of what Unity does for you is provide some base functionality that makes it super simple to do sort of customizations and magic of code without having to know a ton about programming. You don't have to have massive, if you know programming, object-oriented, hierarchies. You can just have a script, and the script can just do the one thing you want. and you can drag it around and use it in other places. So for example, we'll go into my cube script, and I'll open this up in my IDE, and I'll expand it out just so we can see everything. So Writer is not that far off from VS Code. It has some different conventions and standards, but just like any editor, it does a lot of the same things of any script editor, but it's geared in a slightly different way than, you know, Microsoft VS Code does. So if any of this stuff doesn't make sense, just know that the main focus here is the code that you look at. So here's our script, and there's a couple of things about script. If you don't know coding, very basic things that you should know. At the top here, all this using nonsense, this is just basically saying, here's all these packages I want to use. So earlier I said there's a package manager in Unity. Well, this is kind of like me saying, okay, of all the packages I have, here's a specific package I need to use. Oftentimes, you will not have to remember anything about what goes up there. Either your IDE will suggest one for you, or the tutorial you're watching is going to say, add a using statement and do that thing, right? As you can see here, we have the script name, and it has something called monoBehavior as its type of class. MonoBehavior is the base class that's used for all of Unity objects. Okay, so we get into the script. You can see that when you create a script in Unity, you have some baseline methods that are created. So these methods are things that get hooked into the system automatically. The start method, it's basically when the object's created and you want to start stuff up. It's where you initialize things. If you have some objects you're working with, you want to manipulate or use, that's where you do start. Update happens on a cycle within the Unity application, which is update actually happens in a non-normal time. It's basically, it kind of goes with the performance of the system. So if your system is lagging, update kind of goes with the lag. So a lot of times you want to do update for most of the things that you're going to do. And update is just something that's like, okay, this is happening in a certain time frame, which is, you know, milliseconds of time. And if I want to do something that's repetitive, like I want to have a blinking light or a person who's kind of dancing, or I want to check for input, I put it into the update method. So those are important, but to be honest, just know that what Unity tries to do is give you a lot of things for free. And those things are really useful. And oftentimes all you have to do is say, oh, I saw it in a tutorial, or I saw it on some code. Let me look it up. Let me go look at monoBehavior, and that will answer my question. But what I thought was the most cool, this is like the Motzi kind of aha moment, the Motzi moment. I like alliteration. So my Motzi moment was when I was watching this awesome tutorial by a guy named James Plus Games. I was learning how to do a 2D platformer. And I saw him go, oh, well, then we got to do public, float, speed. As a refresher, if you're not completely familiar with code, these are called properties or fields. What gets defined at the top here, which is where we usually put these things, they define things, variables that we can access or use within our code. So let's say I have a character and I want to have some kind of velocity. C# uses floats for all of that. So a float is just anything with a point, something. And I want to be able to configure that. I want to say, I'll add one character and I want the speed to be 5, and another character I want the speed to be 10, right? This was my major moment where I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. I just made the change in my code. I'm going to go back to Unity and I'm going to go look at the object I added the script to. And you can see right there, bam! This is okay. So this is what got me really excited about Unity, folks, is this particular thing. I can define properties in my code, and Unity is smart enough to pick up on that code and say, oh, you have this thing that you want to configure. Let me put it up here for you to edit. And the best part about this is whatever I put here for this script, if I go to another object and I add that script to it, I can have a different value. So you see this a lot. And to me, this is one of the keystone pieces. This is so important as a developer. This is so important as someone learning Unity to understand that it's incredibly simple. And you should think about it as incredibly simple because coding itself is not hard. Logic takes some time, but coding itself is not hard as long as you know the right places to put your words. And this is a super important thing that's part of your code. So if I put public float speed here and down in the update, I want to do something with that speed, like I can do. And this is one thing I was going to show from a code perspective. This is a good thing to know. Debug.log. Let's say I just want to access the value of speed. I can put this here and I'll do toString. Now this is going to happen a lot of times when I run my code, but I'm still going to show you. So if I go back to my project, I put speed here as 10, I put speed here as 5. Let me back up for just a second and talk about the game window. It's actually one that I skipped. The game window is when you're running your game, what you see. You can see there's nothing there right now. And that's because my camera is not pointing at anything. So just so we can actually see what's going on, we're gonna move the camera, be right there, so we get the cubes in view. They're not gonna do anything. We're not writing interactive code yet. That's for the future. But you can see here what you'll see when you go to the game. So if I go back and forth here, the game's not running, but it does give me a preview of what I'm going to see when the game is running. So when I run this, there's this thing called a console. The console is output for the game. It'll show things like errors that happen if something's broken, or debug.log console statements. And you might say, well, what's this magic debug.log? Well, this is what's called a static reference. There's a class called debug built into the framework. So debug log will put things into the console. So when I hit play, you're gonna see the console get loaded with stuff. It won't even stop, right? Because these are happening in this update method. So you can even see like it's just constantly running. It's gonna, it's 999 plus, right? I'm filling up my log with all these statements, and I'm getting 5 and 10. So I'm getting the debug statements from both cubes that I added my script to. Like, okay, well, I have this cube, but I don't really want this one to work right now. So I'm just gonna disable it. This little checkbox, I can actually disable functionality from here, and it's super useful for someone who's learning and testing things. So now if I run it again, and for clarity, I'm going to clear this. If I run this again, I should only see 5, and I only see 5. Here's another thing you should know about the way Unity treats your game. You can actually see your editing view while you're playing a game. You can actually mess with these values and see what happens if you change it. So if I go back to the cube here while the game is running and I change this to 10, you should start seeing 10 show up, or 15, right? Unity's highly interactive, so it lets you as a developer work with your game kind of real time and live, so you kind of test things and mess with things. I can even turn this off if I don't want to see those values, and you can see that it stopped outputting. Or I can turn it back on, or I can go back to here and I can turn this back on. So lots of really interesting things. You notice I can't mess with the values here, but I could go back here and I can pick this object and I can move these objects up and go back to the game, and you see they moved up. Or what I do in my view is I actually have the game window in a different place. So I can see the game and I can see the edit view, and I can actually move the game around while it's running. So there's a lot of power behind how you can work with your Unity game and mess around with it. You may have heard this term called prefab, which when I heard the term prefab, it sounds really fancy and complicated and confusing and like, oh, I have to like do some crazy rendering and fabricate something. I don't know. The word sounded really confusing to me. And then I found out a prefab is just kind of like a stored version of a game object that you can reuse. If I have like my test cube, this is a game object with all this different configuration, and we have our subcube here and we have our scripts associated with it. Let's say I want to reuse this in many different places. If I have more scenes, right? So I have one scene here, but let's say I make a brand new scene and I want to bring that stuff over with me. Is I can go in here and I can create a scene. We'll call this scene 2. I'm going to drag this object straight down to my prefabs. And so it just does it. It moves my object down to my prefabs folder, and this is the collection of that object. So now you can see it becomes blue. It indicates that that is a prefab and it's some kind of reusable code. And if I go back to my second scene, scene 2, I can drag that object up into my window, and now I have a copy of whatever it was I configured in the other window. So you see here, the script is turned off because that's part of the prefab. When you have a prefab, you can actually change values that don't get shared. So I could have something that, okay, it's a prefab, but I want to save, I want it to be turned on here and not over there. That's fine. And you can see here, if I go back to the other scene, if I go back to here, you can see it's still turned on. But let's say I decided that this is actually the representative set. I want all of my prefabs to make use of this. I can actually go here. So this is where at this inspector menu has a new thing, right? Prefab open, select, or overwrites. So I can either say, oh, you know what? I don't like what I set. I want to go back to whatever the original object was. I can revert. Or I can apply. Applying will take these changes and push them down to the prefab. So now the prefab this is the representative set of the prefab. So I go back to scene 1 and go back to my test cube, it automatically updated that prefab that I was working with. So as a developer, as you're coming up with ways to reuse your functionality, this is a really useful thing to do. That's what prefabs are, and that's how you use them. So in this tutorial, we covered all the basics on how the system fits together in Unity, the assets, the hierarchy, the inspector, and how to find your way around the system. In future tutorials, I'll actually talk about code. I will talk about platforming and animations and camera rigging. I'll try to come up with little interesting tidbits that are quick and easy to learn. So future tutorials, I will keep them very short and really targeted on learning a byte of information. Once you know how everything is aligned here, though, it becomes a lot easier to figure out how to learn the next level and the next thing you need to learn in Unity. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.